We're in Honolulu. Why didn't you come to the airport yesterday, sweetie? My mother's sugary voice through the phone made my stomach turn. I stood frozen in the middle of Dallas International Airport, my packed suitcase beside me, as the truth slowly sank in. They had deliberately lied about our flight date. Around me, families embraced, travelers rushed to gates, and airport announcements echoed through the vast terminal. But all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears as the pieces clicked into place. The confusion about dates. The insistence on handling all the bookings themselves. The vague responses whenever I asked for details. What do you mean yesterday? I managed to say, my voice shaking despite my attempt to stay calm. You told me the flight was today at 2 p.m. I have the text messages to prove it. The bustling airport suddenly felt suffocating as other travelers rushed past me, their excitement for their own journeys only highlighting my growing devastation. I clutched my phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. Oh, sweetie, there must have been some confusion, my mother replied, but I could hear the lie in her voice, a slight hesitation, the overly smooth tone she used when covering up uncomfortable truths. Your sister made it just fine. We're all settled in at the resort now. Of course my sister made it. Jennifer was always their priority, their golden child. I should have known something was off when they insisted on handling all the flight arrangements themselves, claiming it would be easier that way. The same parents who relied on me to help pay their bills somehow couldn't trust me to book my own ticket. This wasn't a confusion, Mom, I said, my voice growing stronger as anger replaced shock. You deliberately gave me the wrong date. You never wanted me on this trip, did you? The silence on the other end was deafening. Then, now, Melissa, don't be dramatic. These things happen. I ended the call, my hand trembling. Around me, families embraced as they prepared for their own vacations while I stood alone, betrayed by the people who should have loved me most. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been sending them money every month for the past 2 years, $200-300 each time, helping them maintain their lifestyle after my dad's early retirement. They relied on my financial support for everything from medical bills to groceries, and still, they chose to exclude me from our family vacation. Looking at my useless suitcase filled with summer clothes, bikinis, and sunscreen, I felt tears welling up in my eyes. But more than sadness, I felt a burning anger rising inside me. This wasn't just about a missed vacation, it was about years of manipulation and favoritism. Standing there in the airport, I made a decision that would change everything. I've always wondered if my parents ever truly saw me as their daughter or just as their personal bank account. Growing up, everything was about Jennifer, her dance recitals, her straight A's, her perfect smile. I learned to live in her shadow, but I never stopped trying to earn my parents' love and approval. 6 years ago, when I graduated from college with a degree in computer science, I had my future mapped out. A promising job offer from a cutting-edge startup that aligned perfectly with my interests and career goals. It wasn't the highest-paying option, but it offered growth, mentorship, and work I was passionate about. I was ready to begin building my own life. Then came the desperate call from my father. Melissa, I don't know what to do, he had said, his voice breaking. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage payments. The bank is threatening foreclosure. Your mother doesn't know yet, it would destroy her. I remember staring at my apartment wall, the acceptance letter from the startup still on my kitchen table. How much do you need, Dad? About $9,000 would get us current. I know it's a lot to ask, but it's just temporary. Things will turn around in a few months, I promise. I withdrew most of my savings and sent it to them. Then I turned down the startup and accepted a position at a large corporation that paid significantly more, though the work was less fulfilling. Just for a little while, I told myself. Until they get back on their feet. But temporary became permanent. Just this once became a regular occurrence. That $9,000 was just the beginning. After graduating college, I threw myself into my IT career, working overtime and weekends to climb the corporate ladder. Within 5 years, I had earned my position as a project manager, leading a team of 12 people and handling major client accounts. That's when my dad decided to retire early, 3 years ago, due to his arthritis. Their savings had dwindled from supporting Jennifer's failed acting career, and suddenly they were struggling to make ends meet. Without hesitation, I stepped in to help. Every month, I sent them $2,300 to cover their mortgage and utilities. When unexpected medical bills came up, I covered those too. Last year alone, I gave them over $35,000, money I had planned to use for a down payment on my own house. "We're so blessed to have such a generous daughter," my mom would say during our weekly calls. But those calls always ended the same way, with updates about Jennifer's latest audition or her new headshots. They never asked about my work or my life unless they needed something. 2 months ago, when they mentioned planning a family trip to Hawaii, I was thrilled. Finally, a chance to spend quality time together. They insisted on handling all the arrangements since Dad had airline miles to use. "Don't worry about anything," they said. "Just focus on your big client meeting. We'll take care of everything." Like a fool, I believed them. I even transferred an extra $3,500 to their account to help cover the resort expenses. "It's the least I can do," I told them, imagining lazy days on the beach and family dinners watching the sunset. I thought maybe this trip would be different, that they would finally see me as more than just their financial safety net. Instead, here I was, standing in an empty airport with a packed suitcase and a broken heart. My phone buzzed with a new message. A photo from Jennifer of her and our parents at the beach, cocktails in hand. The caption read, "Family vacation begins. Missing you, sis, wish you could have made it." The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. Standing there in the airport, staring at Jennifer's photo, something inside me finally snapped. I started scrolling through past text messages from my parents, and the pattern became crystal clear. Every conversation about the trip had been carefully orchestrated to ensure I'd miss it. The flight's at 2 p.m. on the 20th, my mom had texted. But looking at Jennifer's Instagram story, I could see their boarding passes from yesterday, the 19th, clear as day. They hadn't made a mistake. They'd planned this deception down to the last detail. My phone rang again. This time it was my father. "Melissa," he started, his voice stern like I was a child being scolded. "Your mother is very upset by your attitude. We made an honest mistake with the dates, and you're turning this into a drama. You're a grown woman, you should understand these things happen." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. An honest mistake? Then why did Jennifer know the correct date? Why did you insist on booking everything yourselves? Why have you been lying to me for weeks? "Now listen here," he began, but I cut him off. "No, Dad, you listen. I just checked my bank statements. Last week I sent you $3,500 for this trip. Was that a mistake too, or did you just take my money knowing you'd leave me behind?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. "Melissa," he finally said, his voice softer now, trying a different approach. "You know we're on a fixed income. We needed that money for the trip. You're doing so well in your career, you understand about making sacrifices for family, don't you?" My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. Sacrifices for family? I've been making sacrifices for years. I've given up my savings, my dreams of buying a house, everything to support you and Mom. And this is how you repay me? "Don't be selfish," he snapped. "Your sister needed this vacation. She's been under so much stress with her acting career." "Her acting career?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You mean the hobby you've been funding with my money while she lives rent-free in your house? The auditions that never lead anywhere while I work 60-hour weeks to support all of you?" "That's enough," he shouted. "I won't stand for this disrespect. You've changed, Melissa. Money has made you cruel." In that moment, something shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, but now it was hardening into resolve. "You're right about one thing, Dad. I have changed. And things are about to change even more." I ended the call and opened my banking app. It was time to close the Bank of Melissa permanently. The drive home from the airport was a blur of anger and determination. I spent the evening documenting everything, screenshots of text messages, bank transfers, a detailed spreadsheet of every penny I'd given them over the past 2 years. The total made me feel sick, $52,630. That's what my parents' love had cost me. The next morning, I walked into my bank and closed the joint account I'd opened to transfer money to them. Then I called my company's HR department to remove my parents as beneficiaries from my life insurance policy. With each step, I felt lighter, as if I was finally breaking free from invisible chains. That's when the messages started flooding in. First came the guilt trips from my mother. "I can't sleep knowing you're upset with us. This is tearing our family apart. How could you be so heartless?" Then Jennifer joined in, "OMG, you're being so dramatic. It was just a miscommunication. Mom's crying every day because of you." But it was my father's message that really showed their true colors. "We raised you better than this. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Your mother needs her medication refilled this week. Don't you dare abandon your responsibilities to this family." I stared at my phone, amazed by their audacity. My responsibilities to the family? What about their responsibility to treat me with basic respect? Instead of responding, I drafted a clear, firm email. "Dear Mom, Dad, and Jennifer. I've done a lot of thinking since yesterday. The Hawaii incident wasn't a miscommunication, it was a deliberate choice to exclude me while still taking my money. This pattern of behavior ends now. Effective immediately, I am cutting off all financial support. The money I've provided was a choice, not an obligation. You'll need to find another way to cover your expenses. Do not contact me about money again. I need time and space to reevaluate our relationship. Thanks, Melissa." Within minutes, my phone exploded with calls and texts. My mother left sobbing voicemails about how they'd lose the house. Jennifer sent angry messages calling me selfish and heartless. My father's texts grew increasingly threatening, warning me about the consequences if I didn't come to my senses. I blocked them all. That evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, doubt tried to creep in. Years of conditioning had taught me to put their needs first, to believe I was selfish for having boundaries. But then I remembered standing in that airport, realizing they had planned and executed their betrayal while spending my money. I remembered all the times I'd sacrificed for them, only to be treated as an afterthought. For the first time in years, I slept without the weight of their expectations crushing me. The next day at work, I received an unexpected visit. Margaret, my father's sister, walked into my office just after lunch. I hadn't seen her in months. She and my father had a complicated relationship, and she rarely attended family gatherings. But there she was, standing awkwardly by my desk, clutching her handbag. "I heard what happened," she said, sitting down across from me. "Your parents asked me to talk some sense into you." I braced myself for more guilt trips, but Margaret surprised me. "What they did was cruel, Melissa. I've watched them take advantage of your kindness for years. It's time someone told you the truth. You deserve better than this." Tears welled up in my eyes as she reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. Finally, someone in my family saw me who really saw me. "I've known my brother his whole life," Margaret continued. "Richard has always been charming when he wants something and manipulative when he doesn't get his way. Your mother Carol enables him. They've been playing this game for decades." I felt a strange mix of validation and grief. "I just don't understand why," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've done everything they asked. I've given them so much." Margaret's expression softened. "It's not about you, honey. It never was. Some people are just takers. They'll drain you dry and still ask for more." "What about Jennifer?" I asked. "She's always been their favorite." "Jennifer is a product of their manipulation too," Margaret sighed. "They've trained her to expect everything to be handed to her. She's never had to work for anything." We talked for over an hour, with Margaret filling in gaps in my understanding of my family's dynamics. As she was leaving, she gave me a final piece of advice: "They'll try everything to pull you back in. Stay strong. You're doing the right thing." That night, I had a dream about my childhood. I was 10 years old, proudly showing my father the science project I'd worked on for weeks. He glanced at it briefly, then turned his attention back to Jennifer's dance recital costume. "That's nice, Melissa," he said distractedly. "But can you help your sister with her hair? She needs to look perfect for her performance tomorrow." I woke up with tears streaming down my face, finally understanding a pattern that had been present my entire life. The next week was surprisingly peaceful without the constant demands from my family. I threw myself into my work, staying late at the office to finish a major project. My team had noticed the change in me, more focused, less anxious. "You seem different," my colleague Amy commented during lunch. I smiled, realizing she was right. "I've made some changes in my personal life. Setting boundaries." "Good for you," she said, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. "Boundaries are sexy." I laughed, feeling a genuine lightness I hadn't experienced in years. But the peace was short-lived. On Friday afternoon, as I was packing up to leave the office, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Melissa?" It was my mother, calling from what must have been a friend's phone to bypass my blocks. "Please don't hang up. Your father is in the hospital." My heart skipped a beat. Despite everything, the thought of my father being seriously ill sent a wave of panic through me. "What happened?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "His blood pressure spiked dangerously high," she said, her voice trembling. "The doctor says it's stress-related. He's asking for you, Melissa. He needs to see you." I closed my eyes, remembering Margaret's warning. This could be genuine, or it could be another manipulation tactic. Either way, I needed to protect myself. "Which hospital?" I asked. "Mercy General. Room 412, she replied quickly. "I'll stop by tomorrow morning," I said firmly. "But Mom, this doesn't change anything about the financial situation." She started to protest, but I cut her off. "I need to go now. I'll see Dad tomorrow." After hanging up, I immediately called Margaret. "Dad's in the hospital. Blood pressure issues, apparently. Do you know anything about this?" Margaret was silent for a moment. "Let me make a few calls and get back to you." 20 minutes later, she called back. "I spoke with Richard's doctor. I'm still listed as his emergency contact from years ago. He did go to the with high blood pressure, but it wasn't serious. They gave him medication and released him. He's not admitted, Melissa." My stomach dropped. Mom told me he was in room 412 at Mercy General. "It's another manipulation," Margaret said gently. "They're desperate." I felt a strange mix of relief that my father wasn't seriously ill and anger that they would lie about something so important. The last threads of guilt I'd been holding on to began to unravel. "Thanks for checking, Aunt Margaret," I said. "I don't know what I'd do without you right now." "You'd be just fine," she replied with conviction. "You're stronger than you know." The next day, instead of going to a hospital room that didn't exist, I treated myself to a spa day, something I'd always put off as too expensive or self-indulgent. As I sat in the sauna, letting the heat melt away the tension in my shoulders, I thought about all the ways I denied myself simple pleasures while sending thousands to my parents. No more. That afternoon, I received an email from Jennifer. Unlike the angry texts from before, this one was more measured. "Melissa, I know you're upset about the Hawaii thing, and I get it. But please think about Mom and Dad. They're really struggling without your help. Dad's blood pressure is through the roof, and Mom can't stop crying. I know they're not perfect, but they're our parents. We can't just abandon them because of one mistake. Can we talk? Just you and me, Jen." I read the email twice, noting the subtle guilt manipulation and the minimization of what had happened. One mistake, as if this wasn't the culmination of years of being used and taken for granted. I decided not to respond. If Jennifer wanted to talk, she would need to acknowledge what had really happened, not downplay it to make me feel guilty. Days turned into weeks. The desperate messages from my family gradually became less frequent as they realized their usual tactics weren't working. I focused on rebuilding my life, reconnecting with friends I'd neglected, exploring hobbies I'd abandoned, and finally meeting with a financial advisor to rebuild my savings. "You've been supporting your parents for how long?" the advisor, Ms. Reynolds, asked, looking up from my financial statements with raised eyebrows. "About 2 years officially," I replied. "But smaller amounts for several years before that." She shook her head. "And they're both able-bodied?" "Your father took early retirement by choice, not necessity?" I nodded, feeling a twinge of embarrassment. When laid out like that, it sounded absurd that I'd agreed to this arrangement. "Melissa, at the rate you were going, you would have delayed your own retirement by at least a decade," Ms. Reynolds said, showing me a projection chart. "Not to mention the opportunity cost of that down payment you gave up." Seeing the numbers in black and white was sobering. But the new projections, what I could achieve now that I wasn't supporting 3 additional adults, were encouraging. In 5 years, I could be a homeowner. In 15, I could be financially independent. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't weighed down by my family's expectations and needs. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. 3 weeks after I cut off contact, I ran into my mother's friend Susan at the grocery store. She did a double take when she saw me, then rushed over with concern etched on her face. "Melissa, how are you holding up?" she asked, placing a sympathetic hand on my arm. "We've all been so worried about you since the breakdown." I stared at her, confused. "Breakdown? What breakdown?" Susan looked uncomfortable. "Oh, your mother said you'd had some sort of mental health crisis. That you'd cut off the family and were making all sorts of wild accusations. She's been asking everyone to pray for you." The realization of what my parents were doing hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just trying to get me back in line, they were actively destroying my reputation, painting me as unstable to anyone who would listen. "Susan," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside, "I haven't had a breakdown. I've simply stopped financially supporting my parents after discovering they've been taking advantage of me for years." Her eyes widened, and I could see her mentally reassessing everything she'd been told. "I'm actually doing quite well," I continued. "Better than I have in a long time. Please feel free to share that with anyone who asks." I left her standing there, mouth slightly agape, and finished my shopping with my head held high. On the drive home, though, I couldn't stop thinking about how many other friends and acquaintances had been fed this narrative about me. How many people now viewed me as mentally unstable or ungrateful? The thought made me sick. But it also strengthened my resolve. If my parents were willing to go this far to maintain control, to preserve their image at my expense, then I had made the right decision in cutting them off. That evening, I made a difficult decision. I posted a brief, factual statement on my social media accounts. "Friends and family, I've become aware that concerning rumors are being spread about my mental health. I want to assure everyone that I am well and thriving. I have made some difficult personal decisions recently regarding boundaries with certain family members, but these decisions were made from a place of clarity and self-respect, not instability. Thank you for your concern, but please check facts before accepting rumors." It was vague enough to maintain dignity, but clear enough to counter the narrative my parents were spreading. Within minutes, messages of support started coming in, along with revelations from others who had witnessed my parents' behavior over the years but had never said anything. I always wondered how they afforded that new car on retirement income. "Your mom once bragged to me about how much you were sending them each month." I thought it was weird. Each message was validation that I wasn't crazy, that others had seen glimpses of what I'd been too close to recognize. But they also reinforced how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. How had I not seen what apparently had been obvious to others? The next day, my phone rang with Aunt Margaret's number. "I saw your post," she said without preamble. "It was brave and necessary. But Melissa, there's something else we need to discuss. Can you come over for dinner tonight? There's someone I think you should meet." Intrigued and slightly concerned, I agreed. When I arrived at Margaret's modest suburban home that evening, I was surprised to find a middle-aged man in a suit sitting in her living room. "Melissa, this is David Cohen," Margaret introduced us. He's a friend and a financial investigator. I've asked him here because, well, after what happened, I started looking into some things. David shook my hand firmly. Your aunt is concerned about some financial irregularities she's noticed with your parents. When she described the situation, I agreed it warranted a closer look. My stomach tightened. What kind of irregularities? Margaret gestured to the dining table, where several folders were spread out. Your father came to me last week asking for a loan. He let slip some things that didn't add up, so I did some digging. What she showed me made my blood run cold. Bank statements, loan applications, and credit card bills painted a disturbing picture. My parents hadn't just been using my money for basic expenses, they'd been living far beyond their means, counting on my support to cover their extravagant lifestyle. Look at this, Margaret pointed to a credit card statement. They took out a new card in your name 3 months ago. Have you checked your credit report recently? My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and downloaded my credit report. There it was, a $155,000 credit card I never knew existed. They had used my social security number and personal information to open it. That's identity theft, David said quietly. It's a crime, Melissa. I felt like I couldn't breathe. How could they do this? There's more, Margaret continued. Remember that story about Jennifer's acting career? She's not even in California for auditions. She's been living at home this whole time, working part-time at a local coffee shop. The money they claimed was for her headshots and acting classes? They've been using it for gambling. The room spun as pieces fell into place, the constant requests for more money, the vague explanations, the guilt trips when I asked questions. It wasn't just emotional manipulation, it was fraud. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Please, sweetie, we need to talk. Your father's having chest pains from all this stress. If anything happens to him, it'll be your fault. I showed Margaret the message. She shook her head. More manipulation. They're desperate because their house of cards is falling apart without your money. What should I do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of their deception. David leaned forward. You have 2 choices. You can press charges for the identity theft, or you can handle this privately. But either way, you need to protect yourself. I thought about years of sacrifice, of putting their needs before mine, of believing their lies. The chest pains, the tears, the guilt trips, it was all part of their game. I want to talk to them one last time, I said. Face to face. But I need you both there with me. Margaret nodded. I'll set it up. But first, we need to gather evidence and freeze your credit. They've shown you who they really are, Melissa. Believe them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the dreams I'd put on hold to support them, the house I wanted to buy, the vacations I never took, the savings I should have had. They hadn't just stolen my money, they'd stolen years of my life. But as I lay there, something else occurred to me. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly clear-headed. The fog of manipulation was lifting, and in its place was a steel-like resolve. They wanted to play games? Fine. But this time, I would be the one making the rules. The confrontation was set for Saturday afternoon at Margaret's house. I spent the morning with David, understanding my options regarding the identity theft. Then I prepared a folder with all the evidence, the credit card statements, bank transfers, text messages, everything I needed them to understand that their game was over. When my parents arrived, Jennifer was with them. She looked nothing like the carefree girl in those Hawaii photos. Her face was drawn, guilty. They filed into Margaret's living room like children called to the principal's office. Thank you for coming, I began, my voice steady. I've discovered some things we need to discuss. Melissa, my mother interrupted, tears already starting. No, I cut her off. I'm talking now. I pulled out the credit card statements. Would anyone like to explain this? The color drained from my father's face. Jennifer looked confused, but my mother jumped in quickly. It was an emergency. We were going to tell you. An emergency? I laid out more papers. Like the gambling debts? Or the maxed out credit cards? Or maybe Jennifer's fake acting career? Jennifer's head snapped up. What do you mean, fake? I turned to her. You really don't know? They've been telling me you're in California pursuing acting. That's where all my money supposedly went, your headshots, classes, rent. Jennifer looked at our parents in shock. I've been working at Starbucks. They told me you refused to help with my college tuition. I stared at my sister, seeing genuine confusion in her eyes. And all those designer clothes and spa days? The nightclub outings with your friends? Where did you think that money came from? Jennifer's face flushed with embarrassment as I showed her the photos Margaret had collected. They told me Dad's investments were doing well, she whispered. I had no idea. You've been living on my dime your entire adult life, I said, not unkindly but firmly. All those Christmas presents, vacations, your car, they were all funded by my sacrifice. The room erupted in chaos. Jennifer started crying, my mother tried to explain, and my father stood up, his face red with anger. Enough, he shouted. We did what we had to do. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said, pulling out my final piece of evidence. You committed identity theft. That's a federal crime. I laid out the documents showing the credit card opened in my name without my knowledge or consent. I have two choices here, I continued calmly. Press charges or handle this privately. Your decision. My mother collapsed into theatrical sobs. You wouldn't. We're your parents. Parents don't steal from their children, Margaret interjected. Just then, my father clutched his chest and staggered. My heart, he gasped. Call an ambulance. For a moment, I almost fell for it. But then I saw my mother's face, not panic, but calculation. This was their final play, their attempt to regain control. No, I said firmly. No more manipulation. My father straightened up almost immediately, his heart attack mysteriously forgotten. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're going to sign a repayment agreement for every penny you stole. You're going to close that fraudulent credit card. And you're going to leave me alone. And if we refuse, my father asked, his voice hard. Then I'll press charges, and you can explain your actions to a judge. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, my father nodded, defeated. My mother stared at the floor, her tears suddenly dry. And Jennifer? Jennifer looked at me like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. But the signing of papers was only the beginning. David had already reported their fraud to the authorities, with my permission. 2 weeks later, both my parents were formally charged with identity theft, fraud, and financial exploitation. The evidence was overwhelming. My father's face was ashen as the police officers read him his rights in front of their neighbors. My mother collapsed in theatrical tears, but no one was buying her performance anymore. The local newspaper ran a small story about their arrest, permanently cementing their disgrace in the community. The trial was mercifully quick. My father received a 1-year prison sentence, while my mother got 8 months of house arrest and 5 years of probation. The judge was particularly harsh in his sentencing remarks. You exploited your own daughter's love and trust in the most calculating manner. This court sees many cases of financial fraud, but few are as morally reprehensible as taking advantage of your own child. After my parents left, Jennifer stayed behind. She sat on Margaret's couch, looking small and lost. I didn't know, she said again, her voice barely audible. I swear I didn't know they were stealing from you. I believed her, at least partly. Jennifer had been as much a pawn in their game as I had, though in a different way. They had raised her to expect everything to be handed to her, to believe she was entitled to the lifestyle they provided, a lifestyle funded by my hard work. I need to make this right, she continued. I'll get a full-time job. I'll help pay you back. This isn't your debt to repay, I said, surprising myself with the realization that I meant it. But you do need to understand that things are going to change. I won't be your safety net anymore. Neither will Mom and Dad, they can't afford to be. The implications of this seemed to dawn on Jennifer for the first time. No more designer clothes. No more expensive dinners. No more carelessly spending money she hadn't earned. "What am I going to do?" she asked, looking genuinely terrified. "The same thing most adults do," I replied. "You're going to work, pay your bills, and live within your means." Margaret, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Jennifer, you're welcome to stay with me for a while if you need to get on your feet. But I have conditions. You'll pay rent, not much, but something. You'll help with chores. And you'll get a real job, not just part-time hours." Jennifer nodded slowly, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "I don't know how to thank you both." "You can thank us by growing up," Margaret said kindly but firmly. "It's about time." In the weeks that followed, my parents' carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. Without my financial support, they were forced to sell their house and move into a small apartment. The criminal charges destroyed what little remained of their reputation. My father served his sentence in a minimum security facility, while my mother endured the humiliation of house arrest in their tiny new apartment, an electronic monitor strapped to her ankle. Their retirement accounts were seized to repay their debts, not just to me, but to various other creditors who came forward once the case became public. Their financial advisor was also investigated for helping them commit fraud. Former friends crossed the street to avoid them. Their church group quietly asked them to step down from their leadership positions. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. Jennifer moved in with Margaret temporarily while she figured out her next steps. True to her word, she got a full-time job at a grocery store. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. She called me one evening, her voice small and uncertain. "I'm sorry, Melissa," she said suddenly. "I had no idea what they were doing to you all these years. They've been playing us against each other. I'm so sorry." Her apology meant something, but it couldn't erase years of damage. Still, it was a start. My parents made one final attempt to manipulate me. They showed up at my office unannounced, causing a scene in the lobby. "We'll lose everything," my mother wailed. "After all we've sacrificed for you." I stood my ground, surrounded by concerned colleagues. "You lost me," I said calmly. "That's the only thing that matters. And it was your choice." Security escorted them out, and as I watched them leave, I felt nothing but peace. The guilt that had weighed me down for years was gone. I was no longer their ATM, their emotional punching bag, or their victim. That evening, I booked a trip to Hawaii just for me. As I confirmed the reservation, I smiled at the irony. They had tried to exclude me from a family vacation, but in doing so, they had given me something priceless: freedom. 3 months later, I stood on a beach in Maui, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. This wasn't the family vacation I'd originally imagined, but it was exactly what I needed. Watching the waves gently lap at the shore, I finally understood, sometimes the happiest endings don't involve forgiveness or reconciliation. Sometimes they're about walking away and choosing yourself. Sometimes, real justice requires hard consequences. My parents had planned this Hawaii trip to hurt me, but instead, they'd set me free.